The temperature minus 30 degrees Celsius. Artillery ruptures eardrums, decomposing bodies pile in streets, wallpaper paste becomes sustenance, and the crushing knowledge you've been abandoned to die in Stalingrad engulfs your senses. This nightmare wasn't experienced by just one side. It was the shared reality of both German and Soviet soldiers. "We no longer feel human," wrote one soldier in his diary. "The cold and death have hollowed us." This wasn't selective suffering. It was the inescapable reality for every soul fighting over ruins where a bedroom might change hands 15 times in a single day. What you're about to witness isn't just military history. It's the most extreme environment humans have ever been forced to fight in. Two armies on a collision course. What if the most pivotal battle of World War II wasn't supposed to happen at all? As 1942 unfolded on the Eastern Front, Hitler's gaze wasn't fixed on Stalingrad, but rather on a different prize entirely. Operation Case Blue, the German summer offensive plan, targeted the rich oil fields of the Caucasus region, a resource Hitler desperately needed to fuel his war machine. Stalingrad was merely meant to be a flanking position, not the central focus of the campaign. The oil fields represented a strategic necessity for the Reich. Germany's war effort was consuming petroleum at an alarming rate, and securing the Caucasus would provide the lifeblood needed to continue their military operations across Europe. Military planners had carefully calculated that without additional fuel sources, the German war machine would eventually grind to a halt. This pragmatic, resource-driven strategy, however, would soon be derailed by a combination of fate and Hitler's growing obsession. In a twist that would alter the course of the war, Soviet forces recovered a crashed German plane containing an officer carrying detailed battle plans for Case Blue. This intelligence windfall should have given the Red Army a crucial advantage, allowing them to prepare their defenses accordingly. Yet in a moment that typifies the paranoia that often clouded Soviet leadership, Stalin dismissed this intelligence goldmine. Convinced it was an elaborate German deception designed to draw Soviet forces away from Moscow, Stalin refused to believe the Germans would push so aggressively toward the southern regions. "This is a ruse," Stalin reportedly insisted to his generals. "The Germans want us to believe they're heading south while they prepare another assault on Moscow." This fundamental misreading of German intentions would leave Soviet forces initially unprepared for the coming onslaught, even with the battle plans literally in their hands. Meanwhile, Hitler's strategic priorities were shifting. What began as a secondary objective gradually morphed into an ideological fixation. Stalingrad, bearing the name of his Soviet nemesis, became a symbol that Hitler couldn't ignore. "Taking Stalin's city will break their spirit," he declared to his increasingly concerned military advisors. Professional soldiers like General Paulus understood the dangers of diverting resources from the oil-rich Caucasus to fight for a symbolic victory, but Hitler's obsession prevailed over tactical considerations. As German forces advanced toward Stalingrad, a city of factories along the Volga River, the stage was set for a confrontation of unprecedented scale. The Volga itself represented a strategic prize of immense value, a blue highway that connected the northern and southern fronts, allowing the Soviets to move supplies, reinforcements, and equipment throughout their defensive network. Controlling this waterway would effectively sever this crucial Soviet supply line. The numbers involved were staggering. The German Sixth Army under General Paulus counted approximately 290,000 men at the onset of the battle, a formidable force by any standard. But they would face a Soviet defense that would eventually number around 1.5 million soldiers, bolstered by Stalin's infamous order number, 227, not one step back. This directive explicitly forbade retreat under any circumstances, effectively telling Soviet soldiers to stand their ground or face execution. The psychological impact was immediate. Soviet units prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender ground. German confidence remained high as they approached the city. Having conquered much of Europe with their blitzkrieg tactics, many German officers believed Stalingrad would fall within weeks. They didn't anticipate how the urban landscape would neutralize their advantages in mobility and air power. The Soviets, meanwhile, recognized that defending their industrial heartland was existential. Losing Stalingrad would not only be a propaganda disaster, but would severely hamper their ability to produce the tanks and weapons needed to continue the war. As German forces began their initial advance into the city, both sides found themselves drawn into a type of combat neither had fully prepared for. Traditional battlefield tactics became obsolete as the fighting compressed into a chaotic struggle for individual buildings, streets, and even rooms. The open steppes where German tanks had previously dominated gave way to a shattered urban landscape where a single sniper could halt an entire company's advance. What started as a peripheral objective in Hitler's quest for oil transformed into a battle of wills, a contest of ideologies, and ultimately the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. Neither side had initially intended to commit so fully to the struggle, yet both found themselves pouring irreplaceable resources into the meat grinder that Stalingrad would become. The forgotten civilians trapped in Stalin City. While generals moved armies across maps and soldiers marched to their positions, another tragedy unfolded in the shadow of Stalingrad's looming battle. As German forces approached in the late summer of 1942, approximately 500,000 civilians still remained in the city, ordinary people whose fate would become inextricably linked with one of history's bloodiest urban conflicts. The Soviet leadership made a fatal miscalculation. Despite the approaching danger, authorities delayed evacuation until the very last moment. By August 23, 1942, when German bombers appeared over Stalingrad, only about 100,000 residents had escaped, leaving 400,000 civilians exposed to what followed. A devastating air campaign that destroyed 90% of housing and claimed up to 70,000 lives in days. The sky disappeared behind planes, recalled Maria Smolnikova, a factory worker's daughter. Our neighbors shouted for us to run to the riverbank. My mother grabbed only a photo of my father before we fled. Behind us, our entire street vanished in flames. Faced with annihilation, the remaining civilians underwent a remarkable transformation. Instead of remaining passive victims, they became crucial components of Stalingrad's defense. Women and children formed militias, constructed barricades and tank traps, and somehow kept factories operational despite the chaos. In underground workshops, they continued manufacturing weapons that would be carried directly to the front lines, sometimes only blocks away. For those attempting evacuation, the journey became a nightmare. German aircraft intentionally targeted river crossings, strafing desperate civilians as they tried reaching safety. Bodies floated in the Volga, while survivors on the eastern shore found themselves abandoned without reception centers or organized assistance. Many evacuees disappeared into the countryside, their fates unknown. Many civilians chose to remain despite the escalating danger, some from fatalistic acceptance, others believing the city couldn't possibly fall, and some fearing evacuation more than staying. For many, the decision stemmed from a profound sense of responsibility to defend their homes against invaders. Life under siege demanded extraordinary adaptation. Civilians retreated into sewers, cellars, and ruins, sharing these spaces with soldiers. Underground communities formed for mutual protection, developing intricate systems for gathering food and water. Excursions to scavenge through ruins became desperate gambles with death. Children played unexpectedly vital roles. Their small size allowed them to move through the battle-torn landscape with less suspicion. Many became messengers between Soviet units. Others specialized in foraging missions, accessing abandoned food stores through spaces too small for adults. Some children even participated directly in defense efforts, handling ammunition or serving as spotters. Survival took on grotesque dimensions. People ate weeds from bomb craters, small rodents, and anything remotely edible. Water became precious beyond measure. Winter brought new challenges as temperatures plummeted, forcing people to scavenge materials from ruins for insulation. Through it all, civilians maintained astonishing resilience. Former office workers repaired weapons, school teachers organized shelters for orphan children, and elderly engineers helped soldiers fortify buildings. The line between civilian and combatant blurred as residents became fully integrated into the city's defense. This civilian contribution proved crucial. Soldiers received not just material support, but also psychological strength from civilians fighting alongside them. The Germans, expecting only military opposition, instead encountered an entire city mobilized against them. Every building potentially harboring determined civilians who knew the urban landscape intimately and fought for their homes. Hell in miniature, the urban combat revolution. While civilians transformed the broader defense of Stalingrad, the nature of combat itself underwent a radical transformation within the city's shattered skeleton. The iconic grain elevator stands as perhaps the most startling example of this new reality. Standing 5 stories tall with thick concrete walls, this seemingly ordinary structure became an extraordinary fortress where just 28 Soviet soldiers managed to hold off an entire German division for 5 days straight. The Germans threw everything they had at this handful of defenders: tanks, artillery, waves of infantry, yet the small Soviet force turned each floor into a deadly maze that negated the attackers' overwhelming numerical advantage. This wasn't just heroic resistance, it was the birth of a new form of warfare. The Soviets had discovered what military strategists would later call hugging tactics, deliberately staying so close to German positions that enemy commanders couldn't call in airstrikes or artillery without risking their own men. By collapsing the battlefield to intimate distances, Soviet forces neutralized Germany's greatest advantages. The open field warfare that had served the Wehrmacht so well across Europe became useless in Stalingrad's confined spaces. Soviet military innovation didn't stop there. They pioneered what they called storm groups, specialized teams of just 4 to 8 soldiers armed with submachine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers. These compact units proved devastatingly effective at capturing and holding individual buildings. Unlike traditional platoons, storm groups could maneuver through narrow corridors, stairwells, and bombed-out rooms with deadly efficiency. They operated semi-autonomously, making tactical decisions on the spot without waiting for orders from above. A revolutionary approach for the typically rigid Soviet command structure. For German tankers, Stalingrad quickly became a mechanical graveyard. The mighty panzer divisions that had terrorized the Eastern Front found their advantage evaporating in the urban landscape. Narrow streets channeled tanks into predictable paths, while mountains of rubble created perfect ambush points. Soviet soldiers would lie in wait, letting German tanks pass before attacking them from behind with Molotov cocktails or anti-tank grenades. The armor that protected these steel beasts from the front offered little protection to their vulnerable rear engine compartments. One German tank commander described losing 3 vehicles in a single street. "We turned the corner and immediately lost our lead tank to a hidden anti-tank gun. As we backed up to regroup, Soviet soldiers emerged from a cellar with grenades. By nightfall, I'd lost 15 men and 3 tanks advancing less than 200 meters. Meanwhile, a Soviet sniper recounted spending 3 days in the same pile of rubble, eliminating 26 German soldiers without changing position once. A deadly game of patience unimaginable in conventional warfare. Both sides rapidly adapted their tactics to this strange new battlefield. German forces began using flamethrowers and explosive charges to clear buildings room by room, developing breaching techniques to avoid the deadly bottlenecks of doorways and stairwells. Soviet defenders countered by creating complex networks within buildings, knocking holes between walls to create unexpected firing positions and escape routes. They even utilized Stalingrad's extensive sewer system for movement and launching surprise attacks, emerging from manholes behind German lines before disappearing again into the underground labyrinth. The psychological impact of this combat environment cannot be overstated. Soldiers found themselves fighting over the same rooms for days or even weeks, often separated from the enemy by nothing more than a single wall or floor. The constant proximity of death created a paranoia that hollowed men from the inside. German soldiers wrote home about the terror of never knowing if the next wall contained a Soviet fighter waiting to ambush them. Soviet defenders described the strain of hearing German voices just meters away, sometimes for days, waiting for the inevitable assault. Sleep became nearly impossible as attacks could come from any direction at any hour. Men on both sides described hallucinating from exhaustion, sometimes firing at shadows or imagined movements. The battlefield existed in three dimensions, with danger coming from above and below as well as all sides. A German soldier might secure a room only to be killed by a Soviet fighter breaking through the ceiling or floor hours later. This urban combat rendered traditional military doctrine obsolete virtually overnight. Centuries of tactical evolution built around open-field maneuvers, fire and movement, and clear front lines collapsed in Stalingrad's narrow corridors. The battle transformed warfare from a contest of maneuver into a primitive yet complex struggle for every stairwell, room, and hallway. Units that normally operated at company or platoon level fractured into small teams fighting their own isolated battles with minimal coordination. Commanders on both sides found themselves unable to maintain a coherent picture of the battle, instead relying on the initiative of junior officers and even enlisted men to an unprecedented degree. The trap closes, from hunters to hunted. While German commanders struggled to maintain control amid Stalingrad's urban chaos, a far more devastating strategic disaster was silently taking shape beyond the city limits. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had identified a critical vulnerability in the German position, one that Hitler himself had inadvertently created. The flanks of the German Sixth Army weren't protected by elite Wehrmacht troops, but by significantly less capable Romanian and Italian forces who lacked both the equipment and motivation of their German counterparts. Operation Uranus, as the Soviets named their counter-offensive, was designed to exploit this weakness with surgical precision. While the Germans fixated on capturing individual buildings in Stalingrad, Soviet leadership quietly amassed over 1 million soldiers to spring what would become one of history's most devastating military traps. The plan was elegantly simple: strike the weakest points of the German line, bypass the main German force, and connect the pincers behind them. On November 19, 1942, the winter air cracked with a thunderous roar of Soviet artillery. For 80 minutes, shells pounded Romanian positions north of Stalingrad, creating a hellscape of cratered earth and shattered defenses. When the barrage finally lifted, more than 200 T-34 tanks emerged through the smoke and snow, spearheading the Soviet assault. The Romanian troops, lacking proper anti-tank weapons and winter equipment, stood little chance against this mechanized onslaught. The speed of the Soviet breakthrough was astonishing. Within hours, entire Romanian divisions had collapsed, creating gaping holes in the Axis lines. The following day, a second Soviet force struck from the south, and by November 23rd, the trap had closed. The pincers met at Kalak, 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad, completing the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. In just 4 days, the hunters had become the hunted. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, immediately recognized the catastrophic situation. Military logic dictated an immediate breakout attempt before Soviet forces could solidify their positions. A narrow window existed where escape might have been possible, and Paulus knew it. Yet when he sought permission to withdraw, Hitler's response was unequivocal. There would be no retreat. The Führer, from his headquarters thousands of kilometers away, commanded the Sixth Army to stand fast and defend every meter of ground they had gained. Instead of allowing withdrawal, Hitler made a fateful promise. The trapped forces would be sustained through an ambitious airlift operation. The Luftwaffe, he assured, would deliver all necessary supplies until a relief force could break through the encirclement. Military experts calculated that the minimum requirement to sustain the pocket was 500 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies for nearly 290,000 men. Reality quickly shattered this illusion. The Luftwaffe never came close to meeting these requirements. Weather conditions, Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, and simple logistics conspired against them. On average, only about 114 tons reached the pocket daily, less than a quarter of what was needed. Many transport planes never returned, lost to Soviet fighters or the brutal winter conditions. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, conditions deteriorated with shocking speed. By December, temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, freezing men in their makeshift shelters. The lack of proper winter clothing, Hitler had been confident the campaign would end before winter, turned frostbite into an epidemic. Ammunition became so scarce that German gunners were limited to a few shells per day. Food rations were cut repeatedly until men subsisted on horse meat and whatever they could scavenge from the ruined city. Disease spread rapidly through the weakened ranks. Dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia claimed thousands of lives. Medical supplies ran out, leaving doctors to perform amputations without anesthesia using crude instruments. Many wounded were simply left to die, as no means existed to evacuate them. The once mighty Sixth Army was being hollowed out not just by Soviet bullets, but by Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. Perhaps no moment captures the surreal tragedy better than Christmas 1942 inside the pocket. German soldiers, surrounded and facing inevitable doom, gathered to sing carols in the frozen ruins. The familiar melodies of Silent Night echoed across the battlefield, creating a moment of eerie normality amid catastrophe. Men wrote letters home speaking of eventual victory, knowing they would likely never be delivered. Meanwhile, Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to relieve the encircled forces, faltered against strong Soviet resistance. The relief force, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, came within 48 kilometers of the pocket, but could advance no further. Had Paulus been permitted to break out toward this relief force, a significant portion of the Sixth Army might have been saved. Instead, Hitler's insistence on holding ground condemned them to a slow, agonizing fate. The strategic errors that led to this disaster were numerous, but three stand out. Hitler's decision to weaken the flanks by deploying his best troops inside Stalingrad, his refusal to allow a withdrawal when encirclement became imminent, and his fatal overestimation of the Luftwaffe's supply capabilities. Each mistake compounded the others, creating a perfect storm that would ultimately claim the lives of over 200,000 German soldiers. Voices from the ruins, the human experience. Beyond the strategic miscalculations and military maneuvers lay something far more haunting: the human voices that experienced Stalingrad firsthand. While propaganda machines on both sides manufactured heroic narratives, the private writings of soldiers tell a starkly different story. one where humanity persisted even in the most inhumane conditions. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, who commanded the defense of Stalingrad, documented the relentless nature of the urban combat in his December 1942 field journal. "We fought for every street, every house, and every staircase," he wrote, while sheltering in a bunker near the Volga. "The enemy was everywhere, and we had to be everywhere too." This exhaustive vigilance meant Soviet defenders often went days without proper sleep, their bodies and minds pushed to breaking points that official reports never acknowledge. Across enemy lines, German Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann's diary entries, scrawled during the bitter November fighting, mirror this same grueling reality. When describing the fierce resistance his forces encountered at the grain elevator, Hoffmann wrote with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. "The elevator's occupied not by men, but devils that no flames or bullets can destroy." His words reveal the gradual recognition among German troops that they faced an enemy whose determination matched or exceeded their own. While soldiers documented these brutal realities in private, both military commands engaged in calculated psychological warfare. Soviet forces dropped leaflets promising humane treatment to German soldiers who surrendered, specifically designed to exploit the deteriorating morale within the German ranks. Meanwhile, German propaganda maintained the fiction of imminent victory and reinforcements. Hitler's insistence that surrender was not an option created a tragic stalemate where his own soldiers became victims of both enemy fire and their leadership's obstinacy. Hunger transformed into an enemy as merciless as the opposing forces, a silent predator that hollowed men from within while bullets threatened from without. In their frost-covered notebooks, Soviet defenders described consuming paste, rats, and anything that might provide minimal sustenance. Their bodies became landscapes of deprivation. On the German side, initially better supplied, but eventually trapped, soldiers stole food from remaining civilians and slaughtered their horses for meat. In the most desperate cases, some German soldiers reportedly turned to cannibalism, a horrific detail absent from sanitized official accounts. These parallel experiences occasionally produced unexpected moments of humanity amidst the carnage. German physician Kurt Ruber captured one such instance during a Christmas celebration within the Stalingrad pocket. "Before we had a chance to taste the wine," he wrote in his medical log dated December 25th, "we had to throw ourselves flat on the ground as a stick of bombs fell outside." This scene, men pausing to observe a holiday tradition only to be instantly reminded of their mortal danger, illustrates the surreal juxtaposition of normal human rituals against extraordinary violence. The battle's final days produced particularly moving accounts. In tattered field notebooks, Soviet soldiers recorded their determination to defend their homeland, their entries filled with exhaustion but growing certainty of victory. German soldiers, in contrast, expressed increasing despair in their last letters home, often containing apologies, farewells, and attempts to explain experiences they themselves struggled to comprehend. Reading these testimonies side by side reveals a shared human experience transcending national boundaries. Beneath the ideological conflict lay universal stories of beings pushed to extremes, where survival and comradeship often meant more than abstract national causes. The cold that froze limbs, the fear that kept eyes open despite exhaustion, and the longing for home provided the only psychological refuge for men caught in this crucible of modern warfare. As the brutal siege finally ended, the human cost became painfully clear. The snows of Stalingrad concealed a catastrophic toll, with casualties reaching an almost incomprehensible 2 million souls, a number that would forever redefine the scale of modern warfare. For the captured German soldiers, the ordeal was far from over. Of the 91,000 men taken prisoner, a mere 6,000 would ever see their homeland again, the rest perishing in the harsh conditions of Soviet captivity. The battle fractured the aura of Nazi military supremacy while transforming Stalin's not one step back from desperate order to triumphant rallying cry. For decades afterward, survivors on both sides remained haunted by Stalingrad's horrors, their silence speaking volumes about experiences too horrific to articulate. The ruined city stands as both graveyard and monument, its enduring legacy a testament to humanity's capacity for destruction and, paradoxically, its resilience in the face of unspeakable suffering. If you love uncovering the untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below. What part of the story surprised you the most? Let's keep history alive together. Want something more dramatic or niche specific? Let me know.